So welcome everybody to the next of TTA's summer sessions. Today's session is on compliance and regulation. So hopefully you can all see my presentation here. I'm going to go through some of the most common considerations in compliance and regulation, and I'm going to allow plenty of time for questions because generally speaking, that's what most people would like to do, to ask questions about their specific cases. We will try to be as useful and helpful as possible, but there is a caveat, which is that TTA provides as much supportive, helpful guidance as we can. We're not a law firm, and we're not specifically tax advisors per se. You can get separate professional advice if you really need to, and we recommend if you've got an unusual situation or case, or something which has got particularly high risk or high potential for liability. But nonetheless, we can give you a good overview of the main compliance features that face tuition businesses, and I'm sure we'll be able to give you at least a very good understanding of the basics. If you do have particular questions, you can always email us at info@tutorsassociation.org.uk. And if you want to talk to us about our compliance packs that we offer, which is a set of contracts, and obviously we can support that. I know some of you may already have them, and lots and lots of tuition businesses use those, so we can talk about more about those later if needs be. So there are three main things we wanted to cover today, which are all distinct but all highly relevant to tuition businesses in terms of compliance and regulations as they apply to you. We're going to try and strip out a lot of the jargon. So I suppose there's another caveat, which is there are some more details that could be afforded to you, but we're going to try and avoid leaning too heavily into specific legal regulations and acts of parliament, etc. But we will try and give you an overview of what it means for you on a practical basis and what you need to do. If you do have questions on a more technical level, then obviously we can answer those later, and the contracts that we provide for people do cater for all of that, of course. But we will try and keep it a little bit jargon free as far as possible, so it's relatively easy to understand and to navigate. So the three different bits we're going to address today. First of all, we're going to look at the difference between employment agencies and employment businesses. Now, all businesses, full stop, need to choose whether they're going to be one, the other, or both in relation to the work they do. If you're going to choose a hybrid model where you pick both, there are complications. You need to make sure the work you do as an employment agency is very separate and distinct from the work you do as an employment business. You need to account for it and treat it that way. But we're going to look at those two different models, what they mean for tuition companies, what you can do, what you can't do, what you must do, what you must not do. And hopefully that will give you a good overview of some of the features of being an employment agency or an employment business, a bit of an overview as to the pros and cons of each option, and help you decide. After that, we're going to go through the employment status of tutors. Now, people often confuse this with being an employment business or an employment agency, but in fact, it's completely distinct. So you can have tutors that are employed or self-employed as either an agency or as a business, but obviously it means different things. So we're going to look at employment status of tutors. And employment status is really, really important. If you get employment status wrong, you can potentially be on the hook for quite large penalties or liabilities down the line, which you didn't anticipate, and that can be really catastrophic. So it's really important you do understand what employment status means and some of the key things that are going to play into making that determination. And actually gets made separately in relation to employment rights and employment law, as well as by HMRC in relation to tax and PAYE and things like that. So we do have to be considerate of those two different angles to which we need to be concerned about employment status. We need to make sure we're on top of it and know what we're doing. And the last one, we're going to look at tax in general. This is not specifically a tax webinar, but there are a couple of things that are probably worth bearing in mind. So I've included it in our compliance and regulation summer session, because it is something which a lot of people do get a bit unstuck with at certain times. And it's obviously something that we want to bear in mind. At the end, we'll be able to answer any other questions that people have. But if you do have questions all the way through, there's a little hand icon at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to use the hand icon, and I'll be able to then pick up on the question at a convenient point. So I'll try and answer questions as we go through. Everyone good? Perfect. Okay, moving swiftly onwards. The first one we're going to go through is employment agency and employment business. And these are both business models. So employment agency and employment business are both business models, ways in which your business operates. Now, there is no formal requirement for you to notify anybody of which model you are operating. Okay. But once you do it, you're expected to follow the rules that apply to that model in relation to all of the placements under that model. So you can have a company that operates as a hybrid and that does some of its work as an employment business and some of its work as an employment agency. In fact, quite a few companies do actually do that. However, if you, with regard to all of the work you're doing as an employment agency, you need to follow the employment agency rules. We'll talk a bit more about what that means. And all the work you do as an employment business has to, again, follow all the rules pertaining to employment businesses. Now, Helen, have you got a question at this point that would be worth answering now, or is that a legacy hand? Helen Wilson? Nope, legacy hand. Okay, fine. So what does it mean? So we're going to go through employment business first. Most companies in the UK, or most companies full stop really, operate more or less as an employment business. This is where the business itself, regardless of whether the tutors are self-employed or they're employed, or whether you get all your tutors from a separate company, it doesn't matter. The business itself provides the tuition directly to the client, and whoever provides the tuition works for the business. Now, they either work as an employee, they can be contracted as a self-employed person, or they can work for a separate third-party company that's providing the tutors separately. But whatever's going on, the company in the middle, the employment business itself, is the legal entity that is contracted to provide the tuition and then buys that tuition from somewhere. Okay, pays someone to do it. Now, this has one major implication, which is that all of the revenue of that employment business, where it's applicable for VAT, you must charge VAT, and you must charge VAT on the full amount. So if I'm an employment business, and say I call myself John Nichols Tutoring Co., all right, if I sell tuition for £50 an hour, okay, I have to charge and pay VAT on £50 an hour. So the actual cost of the parents will be £60, 20% on top of that. And it doesn't matter that I'm going to immediately pay the tutor, let's say £30 or £35 for the sake of argument, right? I still have to make sure that I charge the client VAT, or even on the amount that I'm paying directly to the tutor. Amy, is there a question on that?
Hi. Yes, I just wanted to know, does that apply whatever your revenue is? So with the turnover, or is the VAT sort of after the
VAT? So you can register for VAT as a business at any point, but mandatory registration, where you have to register for VAT, you don't have a choice, is when your business is earning over £90,000 of turnover per annum. Okay. And that's £90,000 of VAT-able turnover. If you've got VAT exempt turnover, it doesn't count.
So do you still charge the VAT up to that threshold though?
Now, if you when you register for VAT, ordinarily in normal VAT accounting, and there's a separate, you can understand why I'm stressing the normal one, because there's a separate version that we can talk about in a second. But under normal VAT accounting, you charge and pay VAT at 20%, but then you recover what's called input VAT. So anything you buy that has VAT on it, you get to claim the VAT back, because otherwise you could buy something and have to pay VAT and then sell it on and you have to pay VAT again. And that would make no sense in the economy. So basically, VAT is a charge on consumers only. So if you're a business and you buy and sell things, if you buy things that have VAT added, you can reclaim that as input VAT if it's wholly and exclusively for the purpose of your business. Okay. So where you're buying stationery or software that has VAT added, you'd be able to recover that VAT under the rules. So you'd be able to charge VAT, but then you'd recover it. Some companies register for VAT when they're much smaller than £90,000 turnover per year. And they do that because they can recover the VAT on, if they're buying lots of things that have VAT added, they can recover the VAT and they get a VAT rebate. Now, obviously, when their turnover increases, they'll have to pay VAT on all of the sales they make, and hopefully they'll become profitable and they'll pay more VAT than they end up recovering. but sometimes people will register VAT before they actually have to. That might be one reason. But some people will register VAT before they have to just because they want complete clarity of accounting. They want to set up their business model to work with VAT from the beginning, and they just accept that they're going to pay the VAT when they could have potentially not registered. Okay, but they just want to do it earlier. And the reason I've stressed all this stuff about normal VAT treatment is because you can go onto a flat rate scheme if you're between 90,000, I think. I can't remember what the limit is, but it's something like 90 to 150,000. But don't quote me on that number. But if you're earning just above the £90,000 threshold, there is a separate scheme that you can opt for if you want, which is where you pay a flat rate, which I think is 12% VAT, but you don't recover anything. So if you want to find out more about the flat rate scheme, you can talk to your accountant. Generally speaking, if your business is always going to hover just over the 90,000 or fluctuate just over that, then it would make sense perhaps to be on the flat rate scheme, so you pay slightly less VAT. But for businesses that want to keep growing and growing, obviously that's not going to last for very long. You're going to reach the threshold where you have to go onto the normal VAT accounting scheme anyway. You have to do normal VAT accounting full stop. Does that make sense, Amy?
Yeah, it does. So just to clarify, in terms of the tuition charges for the client, if your turnover is not reaching 85,000 and you're not VAT registered, you don't have to charge them the VAT. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, if you don't register for VAT, you don't charge VAT, you don't pay VAT to HMRC, there's no VAT. So if you always earn £85,000, so the threshold now is £90,000, right? But if you always earn £85,000 a year, always, and you never went over the £90,000 in a 12-month period, then you'd never have to pay VAT if you didn't register.
Yeah. You
could register voluntarily, and then obviously you charge VAT and you pay it and you recover it as normal. That's voluntary. You can do that, but you don't have to. But mandatory registration kicks in at £90,000. So as soon as you go over that £90,000 threshold, or as soon as you know you're going to go over that £90,000 threshold in a 12-month period, you must register for VAT. If you don't register for VAT when you should, there can be very significant penalties, because obviously you're evading tax, which you should pay. So you must register for VAT if your business has a vatable turnover over £90,000 in a year, in any 12-month period. Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Now, it does mean that businesses that are below that £90,000 threshold can be slightly more competitive by simply not having to charge VAT. This is true. That's just the way the tax system works. There's nothing I can say about that, really. That is true, and that's what the situation is. So larger businesses have to be even more efficient in order to be able to be equally competitive, just because of tax. I think that's basically it, really. Okay, so employment businesses, one of the main downsides of being an employment business is this increased liability for vatable turnover. So your vatable turnover will be your entire turnover, including all the amount that gets paid to tutors, because that gets paid to you first. And you have to charge VAT on all of that amount. That sounds fairly straightforward, and it is. Now, obviously, when you're an employment business, the tutor is either going to work for you as an employee, or they're going to work for you as a self-employed contractor. And there's no issue with either of those. An employment business doesn't mean you have to employ the people on contracts of employment, right? They don't have to be employees, legally speaking. This is why employment status is a totally separate point, which we're going to come on to in a minute. So I'm not going to talk any more about it now, but employment status does not necessarily get determined by either of these options. Okay. So just because you're an employment business does not mean you have to have employees. It does not mean that you have to have self-employed people. You can have whichever combination you like, right? That's totally separate consideration. So what's an employment agency? An employment agency does things a little bit differently. What an employment agency sells to clients is not tuition in the tutoring sector context. It sells introduction to tutors. It sells the worker, basically, an introduction to a worker who fits the criteria for the client. So a client comes to you, and if you're an employment agency, the client comes to you and says, okay, I would like some tuition. You say, great, we will introduce you to a tutor. The tutor does not work for the employment agency at any point. Okay. The client then agrees to pay a fee, howsoever it's calculated is up to you and the business. But the employment agency then charges the client a fee based on the introduction, and the fee can be calculated however you and the employment agency and the client agree. Now, normally in an employment agent in an employment agency in a tuition sector, the fee is calculated as some amount of money for each hour of tuition delivered or for each course delivered, right? So you say, oh, every lesson that you get, you pay us £15 or £20 or £25, whatever it might be, covers all your costs. Okay. Sometimes people call that a commission. It's technically, I don't think it technically is a commission, but that fee is an introduction fee, effectively. Now, whether the tutors themselves work on as an employee for the client or work on a self-employed basis for the client is totally separate. Again, employment status is not determined by being an employment agency or an employment business. Okay, but the tutor is then going to work for the client directly. And the tutor doesn't really have a direct contractual relationship with the agency. They allow the agency to provide them with work, and they'll go and then work for the clients the agency has introduced them to. Now, the interesting thing with an employment agency, and the reason why this is attractive to many tuition companies, is that the company only charges VAT on its commission, on the amount that the company actually charges the client itself. Because what the client pays to the tutor themselves is totally separate. It's never regarded as being income for the business. Okay, so let's use our £50 an hour tuition example again that we used with the employment business. So with the employment business, remember, we had £50 being paid directly from the client to the company. Yep, the company invoiced for the full £50, and then the company had to charge and add VAT onto the invoice if they're above the VAT threshold or if they're registered. That made it £60. And so the client pays £60. Okay, £10 is VAT. No one's going to talk about it again. That's going to go to HMRC. Of the £50 remaining, the employment business has paid £35 to the tutor and has kept £15. Okay, goes towards their costs. If we imagine that same scenario as an employment agency, here's how it works. The total cost of tuition is still going to be £50 plus VAT. Okay, but the employment agency is going to invoice the client for £15, which is their commission. And the tutor is separately going to invoice the client for £35, okay, which is their fee. Now, the amounts that are due to the employment agency, the business as it were, and to the tutor, they both add up to the same amount. They're both £50 worth of service. But the employment agency's VATable turnover is £15. So 20% on £15 is £3. Okay. So when the employment agency adds VAT, assuming it's got to the threshold, and don't forget the threshold is now you need to do more hours of tuition to get to the threshold if the amount you're earning from each lesson is less in total turnover. So the £15, we add VAT to that. The client is then going to pay £18 to the tuition company, so £15 for the service of being introduced, and £3 of VAT. And is then going to separately pay £35 to the tutor. Did my example make any sense? If it didn't, that's totally fine. I'm going to go try and break it down, but good. So we've got a really straightforward example where tuition is basically worth 50 quid, okay, £15 to the company, £35 to the tutor, okay. As an employment business, you charge £60, okay, £10 of that is VAT. And then the employment business itself is supposed to then pay the tutor. If you're an employment agency, you charge, well, the client is charged in total £53, £18 by the agency, and £35 by the tutor directly. Now, you might say, well, why do I want to go through isn't that going to be a bit circuitous? Isn't it going to be a bit of a pain in the bum having to get two different invoices from two different people? In theory, yes. So the only real reason to be an employment agency is because the tuition sector generally, the cost of the tutor is often the largest single cost. And you might end up paying quite a lot of VAT for basically what is to add on to the cost of the workforce, which doesn't have VAT attached. Therefore, you can't reclaim any VAT. So unlike a shop or some sort of trading entity which buys things and then recovers the VAT on that, you're not going to be recovering any VAT on what you pay the tutor. Okay, the tutor is almost certainly going to be doing their work for you without any VAT applying. If you're a company, so there's the situation with being an employment agency. One of the main incentives to do it is because it's a better structure with regard to VAT. You have a lower VATable turnover for each hour of lesson, because you only basically the VATable turnover is only the commission. So you'll reach the VAT threshold after you have to do almost twice or three times as many hours of tuition before you get to the VAT threshold. And when you do get to the VAT threshold, okay, the actual VAT impact on the client is going to be reduced because they're only paying VAT on the amount that goes to the company. Okay, so what's the bad side about being an employment agency? Well, you do have to find a workaround for having the client being separately charged by both the company, the agency, and also separately charged by the tutor. And here's where technology comes in. There are technology providers out there that will offer to set up a snazzy system that will allow the tutors to bill separately from the agency, but for the invoices to basically be pooled, or for the invoice that comes that's going to be sent to the client to be split and the payment to be split to each side. Now, it's really, really technical here. That there's some really technical elements that you must abide by. But basically speaking, there's a regulation which says companies cannot make arrangements. Okay, it's more than just make payment. They cannot make arrangement for the payment to tutors if they're operating as an employment agency. Cannot make arrangement for that payment. That means you can't take the money from the client and pay it to the tutor. You're not allowed to do that. The money must never ever be under the employment agency's control. It must never be arranged by the agency themselves as how it's paid. The tutors needs to always have, under the employment agency model, the tutor needs to always have the right to say, I want to be paid either in cash, in magic beans, via this bank account in the Cayman Islands, or whatever it is they want, however it is they want to be paid. That's between them and the client in theory. Now, there are plenty of good bits of software out there which you and the tutor can both voluntarily sign up to save you both a bit of peace of mind and to make your lives a bit easier, which will allow you both to pool your invoice and send it to the client in one go. Okay, Tutor Cruncher does it. I think Pencil Spaces does it now. I think a couple of other people will do it now, or at least they're planning to do it. Okay, but there are a whole bunch of people that can offer you software that the tutor and the agency can voluntarily sign up to that will basically meet this requirement, where the company that's handling the payment is not under the control of the tuition agency themselves. Okay, and that's really important. If you create a separate company to do this for you, that's not going to wash. That's against the rules. Okay, again, I'm promising not to try and stick in too much jargon here and too many references to specific regulations, but you're not allowed to be in control of the arrangement of payment to tutors. Okay, so key summary: employment business better. It's not as good for VAT, but it does mean that you have complete control of the whole process. Basically, the parents are buying the tutoring from you. You pick the tutors, you manage the tutors, you do everything with the tutors. Employment agency reduces the liability for VAT, which obviously is going to be quite significant if a large part of the bill is going to be for the tutor's fee. And as well as that, the employment agency has this situation where it doesn't really employ or engage with the tutors at all. It just introduces them to other clients. Okay. And you need to find some way of getting around the fact that the client will be able to see quite easily that when they pay the split invoices, which are completely fine, Lisa, there's absolutely no problem with that, as long as they're implemented properly. As soon as they pay this invoice, which basically is two invoices in one, they pay them together. Okay. Some goes to the tutor, some goes to the company, and they will obviously then be able to see how much money the company's received. So if you wanted the clients to not realize how much you're paying the tutors, then an employment agency model is not going to work. Okay. So, any questions with employment business, employment agency? Yes, Claire Johnson, great question. If you wanted to do a hybrid model, do you have to have two separate businesses? The answer is no. You can do it all under one business, but you've got to be really careful that the work that you do as an employment business is kept distinct and managed separately from the work you do as an employment agency, because what you're going to be providing to the client is totally different things. Okay. If you're an employment business, you're selling tuition to the client. How you deliver that tuition is up to you. Find someone to do it, but you're selling tuition. If you're an employment agency, you're selling an introduction to a tutor, and that is a very different thing. It's no longer your responsibility as to whether the tutor actually is any good or not, as long as you've introduced a tutor that meets the client's requirements. So if the client says, please introduce me to a tutor who's got a valid DBS check, an enhanced DBS check, and has got a degree in maths, okay? If you check they've got a degree in maths and a DBS check and they meet the client's requirements and you introduce them, you've done your job. It doesn't make much difference to you. It's not your fault if the tutor then turns out to, I don't know, has got a pension for trying to teach half of it in Chinese. Okay. If the client doesn't like it, they can take up the tutor, right? But the client and the tutor then work directly with each other. You're still entitled to a fee if that's what the contract says. If you say I'm entitled to a fee of £15 every lesson, that's totally fine. But the client is working directly with the tutor. And so therefore, if the client has a problem with the tutor, it's not really your fault or your obligation to fix it, right? Now, you might want to say, oh, is it all going well? And if they say no, you might want to pick up the phone to the tutor. But don't forget, when you're an employment agency, the tutor has no obligation to you whatsoever. They don't work for you. They work for the client. So if there's any dispute between what you say and what the client says, what you say has got no bearing at all. It's just like talking to a business associate, right? You've got no other further rights over the client, over the tutor than you would have if you're just a third party. Okay. So that's the distinction. One of the things I forgot to mention earlier, which is probably relevant, is that as an employment business, the VAT impact makes very little difference to organizations like local authorities and schools who can claim back the VAT. So if all of your work or a large proportion of your work is with schools or with local authorities, then they can claim back the VAT anyways. They don't care, right? Doesn't matter if you add VAT on. I mean, the VAT's going to be the same. It's always going to be 20% unless the government changes the VAT rate. But if VAT is 20%, it doesn't matter if you have VAT because they're going to just claim it back. Okay. But in answer to your question, you can have a hybrid model, but you must make sure you treat all of your employment agency jobs as introductions to tutors. And as long as you treat all of your employment business jobs as you providing the tuition and contracting out someone to do it. The contracts need to be different. If you have the TTA's compliance back, we've got separate contracts for this. They're completely rewritten totally differently to cater for that. Okay, the contracts need to be different. The way you operationally deal with the clients and the tutors needs to be different. Okay, even the language you use, you can't use the same language. If you're selling someone tutoring versus you're selling them an introduction, you've got to make it clear what you're selling them. So you be really, really clear. Make sure you have almost completely distinct workflows if you're doing a hybrid model, but you can do it in the same business. Good question from Lisa here. Selling an intro and doing admin, keeping a timetable reminders, hence a weekly fee, not just an introduction fee right at the start. Is this okay for an agency? This is a really, really interesting question. Okay. Now, if you're charging them, it doesn't. It is potentially possible, but you need to structure your contract to make it really clear what the fee is and for how long it applies for and under what conditions it continues to apply. Yeah. So the law does not prescribe levels of fees in the UK and how the fees are calculated. If you want to calculate the fee by the phase of the moon or something, then in theory, it's not the government's responsibility to intervene in that, right? The government doesn't really get involved in saying how much you can charge as long as you and the client both agree, okay? So if you agree with the client that you charge a weekly fee, that's fine. But what you need to be aware of is if you're selling an introduction, the introduction is made at the beginning. And basically what you're doing is you're allowing the client to, that's the only thing you've done, which is of value. It all happens at once at the beginning. Now, in a classic employment agency, the employment agency then bills all at the beginning. Like if you go to an IT recruitment firm, you say, I want a developer that knows JavaScript. Okay, they'll provide you a JavaScript developer that meets your needs. And they'll say, oh, we want 20% of salary, and you've got to pay it straight away. So they provide the introduction to the developer, And then they send you an invoice for 20% of his annual salary or her annual salary, right? And you have to pay it right now. Now, obviously, that's not very attractive in the tuition sector because no one wants to really pay it like that. So if you've got a separate model where you say, oh, actually, you only pay me per week for however long that you work with the tutor, and you have to define that quite carefully. Or if you pay me only for every lesson that you do with the tutor, then that's a more that controls the client's exposure to costs so that you're more competitive. Okay. There's nothing to stop you if you wanted to from only offering to sell introductions to clients for a one-off single large fee. I'll introduce you to a tutor, but you have to pay me £5,000, £5,000. But obviously not many clients would want to do that. So it's not competitive. So the level of fees and how the fees are calculated for the client is not really in the scope of the regulation. Okay. That really has got a lot of latitude, but you've just got to be really careful. You can't have a completely open-ended, indefinite fee. You can't say you've got to pay me a weekly fee forever, right? It could be you've got to pay me a weekly fee for however many weeks. That's fine. Or a weekly fee for every week in which tuition takes place or is scheduled to take place, or however you define it. But bear in mind, you need to define when a weekly fee is still going to apply. And bear in mind that you're actually only charging that weekly fee because of the original introduction you made. Okay. Does it make sense, Lisa? Okay. Sounds like I'm going to get more questions from you in the future, but that's all fine. Okay. Any other questions on the business models and hybrid business models or things like this? Okay. We do offer a compliance pack, which many people have bought in the past because we've spent a lot of money to get it exactly right. We've worked extensively with the people that regulate this area within government. So that's the Employment Agency Standards Inspectorate. They regulate employment agencies and employment businesses, and they tell them off if they're not doing it right. We've worked with those extensively to try and make sure that tuition companies get it right, that tuition companies can be compliant, and that you follow the law. It's really important that you do follow the law. It's a condition of TTA membership, as well as also otherwise potentially being a criminal offence if you break the law. So you must make sure you follow this. This is absolutely critical. Okay, it's not some sort of optional thing you can choose to do. Right, we're going to move swiftly onwards then. We've spent quite a lot of time on this part, but it's part that people always have questions. Now we're going to look at employment status for tutors. So as I've said before, the employment status of tutors is totally separate from the business model. Yeah. Whether you're operating as an employment business or as an employment agency or as a hybrid in different programs or projects or placements under different models, the employment status of the tutors is totally distinct. Now, let me explain here how employment status can be either self-employed or properly employed under both models. So first of all, let's start with an employment business because this one's quite straightforward. As an employment business, you can literally have employees who are tutors. It's perfectly allowed. They could be 0 hours employees, so they only work when you offer them work. They could be part-time employees. You set some hours that they always work and you try and fill those hours. Or they could be full-time employees in theory. Okay, you've employed them on a full-time employment contract, so I don't know, 35 hours a week or something, and they do tuition for you whenever in that week. That you basically tell them when you want them to do tuition, they've got to do it, right? They don't really get any say. It's no element of choice for them. You say, I'm employing you from 9 to 5 every day. You get breaks and whatever else, but within that 9 to 5, I get to decide who you teach, when you teach them. So you can be an employment business and have employees. They deliver the tuition on your behalf and you pay them a salary. And you deduct tax at source via PAYE. You register with HMRC with a PAYE scheme, just the same way you would for any other employees. Okay. And all this thing sounds scary to people that have not done it before, but actually it's not that bad. Loads and loads of businesses have managed to take on employees. You don't have to be the brightest spark in the box. You just have to pay a little bit of attention to what you're doing, use some software, and you pay payroll. Okay. Or you get an accountant to do it for you if you want. Now, that's being an employment business and having employees. You can also be an employment business and have what's called contracts for services with self-employed freelance tutors. Okay, so you sign a contract with a client, say, I'll teach you, tutoring company ABC will teach you maths every Wednesday afternoon from 4 o'clock. Okay, and then you go, well, actually, a company on its own is just effectively a concept, a thick piece of paper. So the company needs to now employ someone or to contract with somebody, e.g., a freelancer, and say, look, hello, Bob, maths tutor extraordinaire. We want to pay you to deliver that hour of tuition every Wednesday at 4 o'clock. Okay, we agree amount that we're going to pay you. Okay, and there's a contract for services that Bob, the tutor, is completely self-employed, goes and works for the employment business. Okay, Bob works for the employment business in line with the contract. So if the contract says you must teach this, that's what he's going to teach, right? But the contract, Bob is completely free to agree that contract and to negotiate that contract with the employment business, and he's free to turn it down if he wants to and say, oh, I don't like the terms of this contract, so I'm not going to agree to it, right? And if he wants to terminate the contract, the termination clause will be in the contract somewhere. You've got to terminate with 3 weeks notice, whatever. Okay, so employment business can have both self-employed or employed tutors, no problem. How does it work for an employment agency? Now, people will sometimes have this misconception that employment agencies must always only ever have self-employed tutors. It's not quite correct. Let me explain. So obviously, if you're an employment agency, you're introducing a tutor. Ordinarily, you're introducing a tutor who will then, the client will work with. But how the client works with that tutor determines the employment status. If the client was to choose to employ this tutor full-time, they're perfectly at liberty to do so. And then if they employ them full-time, if you're operating as an employment agency, you need something in your contract which deals with how you calculate the introduction fee. Often, but not always, it will be a percentage of the annual salary. But obviously, if the annual salary is less than full-time, that might be problematic because we might have an argument over exactly what salary to use or whether it's a full-time equivalent salary and what that should be. So quite frequently, people just put a flat rate. They say, if you want to employ them, that's totally fine. But you've got to pay us £8,000 or £8,000 or £5,000 or £12,000, whatever it is you said it to be. Okay. So that's one way in which the employment agency model can actually end up with employees as tutors that are employees. Okay, if they enter into a contract of employment with the client. Now, in many cases, the tutor will still be self-employed and will work for the client on a self-employed basis. So obviously, the tutor is going to be introduced by the employment agency. Then they can start working for the client on a self-employed basis. At any of these points, though, the important thing is that the client is the one contracting directly with the tutor. Okay, in terms of the actual tuition to be provided, that is up to the client to agree with the tutor directly, and it's not really the concern of the employment agency. The employment agency has no control over the tutor whatsoever. It's not, the employment agency can't say they're our tutor. They're not your tutor. They don't belong to you in any sense. They're not contractually obliged to you under any sense. In fact, there's probably not even a contract between the tutor and the employment agency. Why would there be? No one's paying anyone anything, and no one's giving anyone anything. Okay. All you're doing if you're an employment agency is you're selling something to the client. You're not selling anything to the tutor, and you can't make the tutor pay for things. You can't make the tutor pay for work finding services. That's illegal. Okay. So if you're an employment agency, you introduce tutors. They could then be employed or they could then be self-employed by the client directly. Does that make sense? All good. We get lots of thumbs up. So I presume this is moderately clear. Okay, one-ish. Okay, fine. We can ask questions in just a second. The next point. Why did I make this point about there being two distinct areas? Okay, well, the reason why I'm saying there's two distinct areas because there's employment status for tax, and then there's employment status with regard to employment law. And then, confusingly, the rules aren't quite the same. Okay. Now, there is if you want to work out employment status for tax, there is a good place you can go. It's called CEST. If you check it, if you write in CEST HMRC, then you'll get to a page called Checking Employment Status for Tax. gov.uk website. So this is actually the UK government. This is HMRC published. I'm going to put it in the chat. Okay. If you want to check employment status for tax purposes, i.e. to work out whether you need to deduct tax at source, then you go to this website. If HMRC deems that your tutors are employees for tax purposes, okay, it may or may not relate to whether they're employees for employment law purposes, but if HMRC rules that they're employees for tax purposes, then they can hold you responsible as the business for having deducted and paid their tax at source. This is going to be a whole unholy nightmare for you if it ever happened. You must really, really make sure this does not happen. Okay. If you're using tutors that are self-employed, they must be genuinely self-employed. If they're not, and HMRC comes and challenges it and wins, and they get a ruling that you're actually, these are people that should be deemed to be employees for tax purposes, then you have to pay their tax. And if they haven't paid their tax, well, it's up to you to pay it. Yeah, because HMRC will say, well, you're the employer. Okay. Just having a contract that says they're self-employed is not usually enough. The contract on its own is not enough, or T's and C's. Doesn't matter what you call it. If you've got a written document that says they're self-employed, that's helpful, but it's not enough. If you then treat them as employees, regardless of what the contract says, we're going to have a problem, because HMRC will say, well, you've called them self-employed in name only, but in all other respects, you treat them as though they're an employee. And especially if you have employed tutors and you treat your self-employed tutors as the same, that would be a problem. If you don't treat them as employees, then you're fine, obviously, right? And this is not to scare you, to make you think that you're not allowed to have self-employed tutors. It's not true. But this is just to say, if you have got self-employed tutors, you must make sure they're genuinely self-employed. One way to do this is to use the Check Employment Status Tax tool on HMRC, on the gov.uk website, okay? And you can check, okay? There are lots of factors that they'll ask you loads of questions, like, is the tutor the one that's bears financial risk? So if the tutor doesn't get paid, or if the tutor invests in training and skills, is it their liability to pay or your liability to pay? Because if it's your liability, you're basically like employing them. Yeah. For DBS checks, does the tutor pay because it's their DBS check? They should pay if they want one. Or do you pay because they're working for you? Again, if they're working for you, it makes it seem like they're employed. If the tutor needs tools or materials, like stationery in the case of tuition, or software, who pays? Now, a lot of these things, you can, to some extent, there might be something you buy for the tutors as self-employed tutors. That's fine. But the HMRC Check Employment Status for Tax tool will look at all of these things overall and will reach a determination based on all of these different factors. Okay. Now, with employment law, it's different. Employment law doesn't work under exactly the same legal rules. And we're not going to go into the jargon, but it doesn't work under exactly the same legal rules as HMRC. However, employment law is whether your tutors are entitled to employment rights, and also, if so, who's the employer. If you're an employment agency, obviously you're not the employer, it's the client. But then you need to make it clear to the client, I suppose, if there's something that might become a risk. So if your tutors claim they are employees, they may claim for things like unfair dismissal. So you might end up with a situation where you think the tutor's self-employed, they work for you loads and loads and loads for years and years, but they think they're employed. And so one day you say, oh, I don't want to give you any more jobs for whatever reason. Okay, that would be fine if they're self-employed. You don't have to give them work. But you do what's in the contract. But if they then say, oh, well, I'm employed by you, so you've got to pay me, otherwise I'm going to take you to an employment tribunal. This is where we have a problem. Because if they're deemed to be employees from an employment tribunal's perspective, they're going to go, well, where's all the holiday pay? Statutory holiday pay. Where's the sick pay? If they've ever been sick, you have to pay. Okay. Now, again, if you actually want them to be employed and factor all these things in as costs, that's totally fine. There's no right or wrong answer, is the last point here. You don't have to have them being self-employed. There's good reasons why some companies might want to employ their tutors. Okay. If you employ your tutors and pay them as employees' salary, that's totally legitimate. You can make that model work really well. You've got way more flexibility to tell the tutors exactly what you want them to do and how you want them to do it. You don't have that right if they're self-employed. If they're self-employed, you contract with them as to what they've got to go and do. Then you've got to let them get on with it themselves, so long as they meet the requirements in the contract. So I've got Claire asking a question about software. If I pay for Pencil Spaces or Tutor Cruncher, if I say it's optional for them to sign up and use, then is that okay when calling them self-employed? Or can I tell them in the contract of service they must use the software I've invested for business? This is a really, really good question. If you specify in the contract that they must use the software, that potentially does get around the issue. But it would be safer to do that if you had some justification. So you can insist that self-employed contractors use specific software to get a specific outcome. But if it becomes too onerous across the board, if you say you've also got to use a company laptop and you've also got to use company internet and you've also got to turn up to my office and you've also got to do this and this and this, then it might become, that's where we get a risk of employment status being deemed to be more their employees. But just saying, oh, you're self-employed, teach how you like, but you must teach using this software because that's the business software that we use. That's fine. Okay. As long as, with the caveat that the software doesn't end up controlling so many aspects of their work that they're effectively being treated like an employee. And one of the things that becomes relevant here is supervision, direction, and control, SDC. If you're if you have the right to supervise them or to direct them, to tell them what to do, basically, or to control them, and basically say you do work here, you don't work here, you do this or you do that. If you have that right, it's one of the bigger indicators that they're actually employed, or they should be deemed to be employed. So if you just put in the contract, please use this software because this is what we all deliver our tuition with, on its own, that should be fine. It's just about being aware of how many other things you're asking them to do, make it seem like they're employed. Does that make sense, Claire? Yeah. So you can get you can get self-employed tutors to follow rules, but they have to be contractual rules, and ideally there should be some justification for it, right? And the justification in this case would be, well, we want our clients to all have a positive experience with us and the tutors that we work with, and therefore we want them to use certain services that we sell to the clients, and we want the tutors to use those services. You can't charge the tutors for those. If you make something mandatory for the tutors to do, it must be no cost, right? You can't charge the tutor and say, oh, by the way, you've got to pay for Tutor Cruncher, or you've got to pay for Pencil Spaces. Well, they might separately want to pay for Pencil Spaces with their own account, but they can't be paying you for Pencil Spaces. You can't also then say, oh, you must use it with us. Okay. Now, there isn't a right or wrong answer as to whether to have employed tutors or whether to have self-employed tutors. It's totally up to you. Okay. There are good reasons for having self-employed tutors. Flexibility. There's some element to which the tutors are responsible for themselves, right? Their own insurance, their own teaching methods and practices. You don't have to have any, you just take someone on who could do the job and you let them get on with it. There are also good reasons why you can have employed tutors actually being employees, especially 0 hours employees, which is most common in the tuition sector. The tutors still have some element of a high degree of flexibility, right? 0 hours means you don't have to you're not obliged to give them any hours of work each week, but you give them work whenever you've got work available. You've got them on this 0 hours employment contract. When they accept work, just like if they accepted a bar shift, if you offer them work and they accept it, they go and deliver the work, and you can tell them how to do it however you like, right? And you deduct tax at source, so they don't have to worry about their tax return, especially for more junior tutors that need more supervision, that need more direction and guidance. They don't know how to do tax returns themselves just yet. Maybe this works. So there is no right or wrong answer, but the main thing is to make sure that you understand how to follow the rules for the option you picked. Okay. If you pick employee, okay, then make sure you factor in holiday pay. So you reduce their salary by a little bit so that you have allowed for the holiday pay and the total cost of the employee. Okay. So if you wanted to pay them £35 an hour, okay, well, maybe you make it £32 an hour or £30 an hour, and you set aside a little bit of money for holiday pay. So when they say they want to go on holiday, you go, oh, we'll pay you for that bit, but you've already set that money aside. Just the same for tax. You can obviously deduct tax from source. So you're going to get tax code for them. You're going to then deduct tax each month when you submit it on your PAYE software. And again, you'll need to learn how to use the software that does PAYE. But again, it's not that difficult. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people have done that. And you just have to follow the rules for the option you pick. Has that been helpful with regard to employment status? Seeing a couple of thumbs up. Any questions on employment status? No questions. Great. Let's move on to the last point, which is tax, including VAT. So we've already covered most of this actually in other parts, because this is really related to the rest of how you structure your business and how you maintain compliance. You obviously have to pay tax, right? As a business, there will be different taxes you have to pay. Obviously, we've talked about VAT already today, and how VAT liability is higher if you're an employment business, because obviously it applies to your sales, not to your profit. Okay, so VAT applies to your sales, and therefore, if you're charging someone £50, you have to add VAT at 20% on £50. If you're charging someone £18 or £15, you add 20% on £15, which obviously is only £3. So VAT is one tax you need to be on top of, and you need to be very, very conscious of if and when you're going to go above that £90,000 threshold in the 12-month period. Every year I get a good handful of phone calls from people going, "Oh my goodness, my turnover is £100,000 and I now have a huge VAT bill." Okay, it's too late for me to help you to do very much by that point, because you have to pay the VAT, right? It's going to wipe out your margin almost entirely, right? What you need to do is you need to plan ahead. If you think you're going to get to that £90,000 point, then you need to plan ahead. Okay, I need to either start adding on VAT now before I'm going to have to pay it, or I'm going to need to reconsider my business model, okay, in some way. Now, obviously, you have to still follow the law. You have to make sure you're registering VAT at the right time. It's absolutely a requirement of TTA membership that you register that you follow the law and you don't try and evade tax or do anything that you shouldn't be doing. Okay, and also the penalties if you do try and evade any of this are very, very severe, and they should be, because it's a level playing field for everybody. Okay, but you have to bear in mind that you should plan in advance. Don't plan in advance that you can always undercut everybody else by not charging VAT and then grow your business, and then suddenly realize, oh, I'm making £90,000 a year now, not 5,000. Well, now we have to charge VAT. A quick point on taxation: the tuition delivered by independent tutors, self-employed sole traders, is VAT exempt always, as long as it is in a subject which is ordinarily taught in schools. However, if that tutor now works for a limited company, any of the tuition they deliver, the same tuition that they deliver, is no longer VAT exempt, even if it's their limited company and they're the only person working for it. Okay, so bear this in mind. If you are running a tuition business, but you're also doing tuition yourself, are you doing tuition yourself through your limited company and therefore having to charge VAT, or as a sole trader and therefore not having to charge VAT? Pick yourself. Okay, if you're doing it as a sole trader, you'll still need to declare it and self-assessment. You'll still need to declare it and pay any tax on it, but you wouldn't necessarily you wouldn't have to pay any VAT. You wouldn't have to charge VAT or pay it, including if you were so remarkably successful as an individual tutor that you go way above the VAT threshold, because it's VAT exempt. It doesn't count towards the VAT threshold. Okay, right. We're not got time to go through tons of other stuff in tax, but you basically need to get an accountant to check what taxes you need to pay. You're going to need to pay corporation tax if you make a profit. You'll need to pay income tax personally if you take money out of your business as an income. Okay, please be very careful if someone sells you some sort of crafty scheme to say, oh, give yourself a loan from your business for £10,000 and never pay it back. But HMRC cracked down on those some years ago and basically said this is an income, so pay tax on it all. And people became bankrupted overnight because they've given themselves tens and tens of thousands of pounds in loans from a business that they're running, thinking it'll be tax-free, and it's not. So Be very, very wary of tax schemes that claim to be too good to be true. They probably are too good to be true, and probably HMRC is going to come after you. And yeah, if you've got any questions about tax specifically, strongly recommend you get an accountant. Other than that, are there any other questions for today? Claire Johnson.
Hi, sorry. So just to be clear on the sole trader thing, so if I'm a sole trader, then any tuition that I do myself, I won't need to include that at all for VAT, but I'll just need to worry about VAT once the tuition from the tutors in my employment business is over 90,000. Is that right?
Yeah, so then if you're doing tuition as a sole trader, the tuition is being bought from you personally and not from your business, and it's paid to your personal bank account, not into your business bank account, then yes, that tuition that's bought from you personally is not going to be subject to VAT, subject to that tuition being in a subject ordinarily taught in an academic institution. Now, that's quite a broad definition, right? If it's English, math, science, then you're all fine. If it's something even like, I don't know, if you can find a university that teaches it, it's fine. So business management studies or whatever, it doesn't have to be like a GCSE subject. Okay, there was the distinction. There was someone tried to once claim that like some sort of meditative training was a subject ordinarily to an academic institution. They lost that. That wasn't regarded as true. But yeah, any tuition bought from you personally in a subject ordinarily taught in an academic institution is exempt from VAT. So you do not have to charge VAT when you're doing that work individually as a sole trader. Obviously, that means you shouldn't put that through your business.
Okay.
Yeah, because otherwise, if it goes into your business bank account and then gets paid to you, the HMRC is going to say that's not, you're not doing it as a sole trader. You're doing it from your business, whatever your business is called, and then the business would be the one that's going to be then clobbered. Okay. Would EYFS be classed as a subject, Hannah? Yes, it would. EYFS is definitely taught in a lot of academic institutions across the country. There's no worry about that being regarded as exempt as a subject which is ordinary taught. Doesn't matter how old they are. If you're paying yourself into your business, if the clients are paying your business and then your business is paying you, then HMRC will say that VAT applies. Now, you can change it and say, oh, I'm not going to do any tuition for my business anymore. I'm only going to do it personally, and tell your clients and sign a different contract with your clients, terminate that bit of the contract with your business, which again, you're the business and you're also the individual, so it's not a problem, and agree with the clients to do it personally, then that's fine. You can do that. Okay. Does it make sense, Claire?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. We've got another couple of questions. Someone says, I've got your employment business contracts, which are excellent. Thank you very much. We spent a lot of money on them. Our teachers tick to say they've read and accepted these when they sign up for us electronically on TutorCrunch. However, do we also need to physically sign physical copies? Now, whether or not you have physical copies signed is not a regulatory issue. Whether or not it's signed at all is not a regulatory issue. Okay. It is just an issue from an enforcement perspective. The main issue you have, if you don't get contracts signed by the tutors, the tutor might argue they never agreed to it. And that might then become problematic if you wanted to enforce any element of that contract. And the tutor says, oh, no, I never saw it. I never agreed to that. I thought I was just doing the tuition under some different terms. Okay. So if you don't sign it, I mean, if they tick a box on TutorCruncher and the TutorCruncher actually has a link to the correct terms and conditions or the correct contract, probably it's enforceable. Right, the tutor has to come up with some incredibly very arcane legal argument to probably say, oh, I couldn't access it, or it was not accessible at the time, or there's some other reason why I couldn't have agreed to it, right? But if they ticked a box, generally speaking, if they had a valid link to go and read it and they've ticked a box to say they've read it, you're probably okay. This is not a regulatory issue for Be My Tutor alternative provision, whoever your name is. This is not a regulatory issue. This is just an enforcement issue. If you want to be absolutely cast iron that it can be enforced, then yeah, fine, you can get them to sign it in ink. That's fine. But you don't need to. And generally speaking, having them sign it digitally or having them agree to it digitally is going to probably be okay, unless they've got some legitimate reason they can argue they didn't agree to it. If, for example, the link was broken and they've said, oh, I've read it, but I only read what was on the broken link, then fine, maybe you're in trouble there. Yeah? Does that make sense? But Be My Tutor alternative provision. they're still here. We're going to move on. And then we've got Serena coming, is not a question, but a point. Oh, Be My Tutors put in the comment. Thank you. Sorry, Adam. Right, Helen, question from you.
Yes. How do you go about dealing with tax, please? Because I'm starting out with this. Obviously, I'd contact HMRC, presumably. I'm just wondering if there's a recommended route, you know, either by phone, by email, or filling in forms online, or what have you, please.
Tax in what respect?
Oh, yes. Well, as a sole trader, then I need to register for tax.
Register for self-assessment.
Self-assessment. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
I'll be completely honest. If you Google registering for self-assessment guidance, you'll get about 500 pages come up that all want to give you good guidance, and most of them will probably want to sell you some accountancy service that will help you. So, which is totally fine. They'll put up a blog saying, "Oh, here's some great guidance." If you love the guidance, you think they're very clever and they're very helpful, and they say, "Do you want to pay us 80 quid to help you do it?" Then you can pay them 80 quid if you want to. It's up to you. It isn't beyond the wit of man to do it yourself, right? You don't have to pay anyone to do it. You can. It's been designed so that anyone with a moderate amount of wit and intelligence can probably do it themselves without needing any paid help. If you want paid help to make your life simpler and easier and more straightforward, there's nothing wrong with doing that. I mean, there's quite a lot of good tax services out there. I know that Go Simple Tax have worked with TTA in the past as well. They offer price competitive guidance on how to do these kinds of things. But your first port of call would be probably a Google search for how to register for self-assessment in the UK. Okay, and then if you need more specific guidance or information, you can come to TTA. We might be able to help you to an extent, or you can go to an accountant who would have much more technical knowledge of taxation. If you had an unusual tax situation, for example, we wouldn't be able to give you any advice on if you're also, I don't know, earning money from this, that, and the other somewhere else. We wouldn't be able to tell you whether how that's going to affect your tax liability, because we're not qualified to do that.
Right.
But if you've got a complex tax situation, then you're probably going to benefit from an accountant being able to say, "Yeah, do it like this, do it like this," and then they structure your tax liabilities so that A, you're actually paying the tax you need to pay, so you're compliant, and B, you're only paying the tax you need to pay. You're not actually structuring things to pay extra tax for some reason.
Right, lovely. Thank you very much, John. Great.
No problem. Any other last questions? No. Well, I hope that was all very helpful for you all. Thank you very much for coming, and I hope you're all going away with a lot more knowledge and understanding about tax. Helen, is that a question or just a vote of confidence? Probably, I don't know, not a question. But if you do have more questions around the compliance packs that TTA offers, they are an additional charge because we spent a lot of money on them and we need to recoup that cost. But it is only £995 plus VAT for members. It's more for non-members. But if you do need that, then you can get in touch with us at info@tutorsassociation.org.uk. Otherwise, thanks very much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at one of the summer sessions very soon.